Alright, so if you're watching this video, there's a chance you watched a video that I made a couple years ago on how to become a freelance Webflow designer and developer in 6 months. Now, since I made that video, a lot has changed, so what I wanted to do was make a video specifically on how I would become a Webflow developer, not a designer, just a developer, if I was starting out today. Now, what I'm thinking in this video is I'm going to cover if it is a good idea to be a Webflow developer if you're deciding in 2024, how to become a great Webflow developer, and if you should choose to become a freelancer or to have a job or to do a mix of both. Now let's start with, is it a good idea to be a Webflow developer in 2024? Now, if you read anything online, you'll see a bunch of people fear-mongering, saying that the industry is saturated, that there's loads of Webflow developers, that you shouldn't start because there's all of these people who are way better than you. This happens in pretty much every single industry, and you should not listen to it at all. As someone who actually runs a studio, so we have designers, developers, and I kind of do a little bit of both, there is so much opportunity for really great Webflow developers. Now, I always see this happen in pretty much every industry, that people will always say it's too saturated, don't start now because you might end up wasting your time. But really what they're saying here is if you're not very good, you will not have many opportunities, you will not have success in that space. What you got to look for when you're deciding to make a move like this, when you're deciding that you're going to have a career in a specific industry, is a couple things. First of all is, how big is that industry, and is that industry growing? Because if the industry is getting smaller, then you're not going to be able to kind of grow with that industry. You're going to have to be really good and take a big percentage of the market share. But if an industry like the Webflow industry is still growing, then the chances are that you can kind of ride the wave as the industry grows, and you can grow with the overall industry. For me, deciding to be a Webflow designer and developer was a great decision, because Webflow was so small at the time when I decided to go all in on Webflow about 4 years ago, that in that time, just the sheer fact that Webflow has grown so much has presented me a lot of opportunities. Now, you might think that 4 years sounds like a long time, but ultimately the actual percentage of sites that are built on Webflow is incredibly low, especially when you're comparing it to something like WordPress. And Webflow as a company is growing really quickly. So if that company is still growing, if the industry is growing, if a lot of companies are moving from these legacy platforms like WordPress and like their old CMS platforms, then it's still a good decision to choose an industry like Webflow where it is growing quickly and you can kind of take advantage of that growth. Now, the other reason I still think it's a great idea to become a Webflow developer is because there is so many bad Webflow developers in the ecosystem. Now, I've been running an agency for a little while, and we've been working with a bunch of different clients in all kinds of industries and a bunch of different Webflow developers on our end. There is a lot of people who are just not very good at building websites. They will produce really poor quality work, and then the client is left with that poor quality work, and they have huge problems because the websites are not scalable, there's no class system, they're performing really poorly, and this all makes people think that there's either something wrong with the freelancers, the agencies in the industry, or there's something wrong with Webflow, the platform. Now, if you can be really good at being a Webflow developer, if you can be a great Webflow developer, then that is your unfair advantage. That is the piece where you can really sell yourself, because there is not many people who are masters of everything in the Webflow ecosystem. I think a lot of this comes from probably two things. One is the fact that Webflow kind of marketed itself as a designer tool, which means that people don't necessarily come from strong development kind of fundamentals, which means there's a lot of opportunity for people who have super strong fundamentals and they actually kind of approach it as a developer versus approaching it as a designer who is turning into a developer. And I think the other reason is just because it's still a very new industry. There's still a lot of people who are kind of flocking to this space because there's a lot of opportunity. So a lot of the people who are building websites are not necessarily kind of super qualified, but there's not been a long enough time for them to be weeded out. There's not been a long enough time for people to realize this person's not doing good work, so we'll work with someone else. I think the thing that amazes me most about this space is I will see websites which I know companies and individuals have charged 20, 30, 40K for, and they are really poor quality websites. They're not using good scalable class systems. They're not making sure that the website is easy to maintain for the client. And what we do when we get a new project is we always like to look at the back end before we accept the project, because that's going to show, okay, how good is this website to kind of work from, and how easy is it going to be for us to build from, or should we start again and kind of scrap it and go from nothing and start from the beginning and then work with the client from that very first phase. Now, the amount of people who deliver really bad work, but I know are in this space, have been charging people lots and lots of money is there. It's like there's a lot of people who kind of have done this and a lot of people who still build businesses doing this. Now, the thing with this is Sure, it doesn't seem great. It doesn't seem great that someone's feeling like they're getting ripped off because they're not producing great work. This person's kind of somewhat scamming or at least just producing really poor work. But there's an opportunity here, because if you can deliver really high quality websites, if you can be the person, the company who is able to do that and able to kind of hit every single basis, even when no one is going to see. So if you're making sure that every single thing is checked, if you're making sure that you're submitting the website to Google Search Console, if you're making sure that all the tags are set up correctly, if you're making sure that the HTML is semantic, all of these super small things that clients are not going to see, but ultimately kind of stack on top of each other and build the website and make it better and better and kind of give it the strongest foundations possible. That is where the opportunity is. That is where there is a lot of opportunity to take these projects from people who are charging loads of money and really kind of just know the idea of how do you build a big agency and how do you kind of charge clients a lot for projects. That can go over to you, that can go over to these companies, that can go over to the company that you work for, because you just focus on quality and eventually quality wins. Because what's going to happen is the best agencies are going to rise to the top, the best freelancers are going to rise to the top. It just takes a little bit of time. So the fact that there is these big projects and the fact that there isn't many people who have super high quality work is a great opportunity, which really leads me on to the second point, and that is how do you become a great Webflow developer? Now, I think in the Webflow space, because it is so kind of designer orientated, because the platform makes it so easy to create animations and all this kind of interaction stuff, it makes it really easy to think that the best websites possible are the most impressive ones. It's the most eye-catching websites. It's the kind of things where there's stuff moving all over the place. But while this stuff obviously is impressive, it's not the basis of what makes a great Webflow developer. Because at the end of the day, a Webflow developer is really kind of a marketing developer. If you're developing a back-end tool, or if you're developing like an app, you're developing the whole app, like you're developing the actual product itself. But if you're a Webflow developer, you're essentially a developer for a marketing website in most cases, because often you're not necessarily building custom web apps. I know you can do that in the space, but it's most of the time you're actually just building marketing websites, which makes you a marketing developer. If you're a designer in this space, you're a marketing designer. And the thing that's so different about this is, sure, interactions and sure, kind of functionality and all this stuff is important, but the most important things here are actually the things that help the people who you're working with. So if the company is looking for a great marketing website, what you need to do is figure out, how do I build a great marketing website? Something that is going to bring leads into the site, so it's going to have strong fundamentals, that's going to help them if they're focusing on SEO, if they're focusing on paid ads, whatever their marketing channels are. It's going to convert really well, because obviously the website is there to make sales or to get people to inquire about a service. And ultimately the website is going to make them more money. So adding a bunch of interactions and all that kind of stuff, it's really cool. Like, you can make a website and create a brand experience that just looks great, feels great, and can be part of this overall strategy. But in most cases, it's not the main thing. The main thing is a website that converts really well, a website that is really easy to find, a website that loads really quickly, a website that has great UX, and a website that is accessible. Ultimately, the main things that make up a great Webflow developer is, can they figure out how to build the best marketing websites? And a lot of this comes down to, how do you nail every single fundamental? That comes down to, are you submitting things to Google Search Console? Are you doing all of those small things that people don't necessarily see, especially if the client doesn't know much about building a website? But these are the things that actually kind of make a difference. If you're moving someone over from a different place, are you setting up 301 redirects? Because if you're not, you're hurting the people you're working with. But setting up 301 redirects doesn't look super fancy. It doesn't look like the animations that you can add in your portfolio and be like, hey, look at all this cool stuff I've done. Ultimately, a great Webflow developer is someone who can absolutely nail all of the fundamentals, do them incredibly well, and then add those extra pieces on top. So adding those micro interactions, adding those small little details that make the experience of being on the website feel super premium. But they don't do that at the expense of all the other things which actually build an effective website and actually help clients. And the other piece with this is having an understanding as to how the website actually works in the greater ecosystem of the company. I think as designers, as developers, as people who build websites, you can think that the website is the only important thing about the business. But ultimately, all that website is there to do is to communicate their value and to really kind of create sales for that company. It's a way for people to understand, this is what the company does, this is why I would work with them, here is how I get in contact with them, or here is how I buy that thing from them. And if you can really understand the greater ecosystem of how all of these pieces fit together, that's when you become incredibly valuable, because you can offer your expertise for strategy and really just helping the company shape what decisions it is that they actually make in future. Because most of the time, the value as a Webflow developer, as a designer, as someone in this space, is actually understanding what work should be done that will actually help the company. So really the way that you become a great Webflow developer in 2024 and really in any year is you focus on how do you become a developer who understands what the actual purpose of these websites are, and that is marketing. You're not just someone who can build kind of fancy animations and do all of this impressive stuff. You focus on what are the fundamentals, what are the actual important pieces that most people miss, and when those people miss it, doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to pay attention to it, because these people are producing bad work and then getting away with it for an X period of time, but eventually it catches up with them. And when it catches up with them, they don't get referrals, they don't get future work. But if you're focusing on all of these things, which sure do take a little bit of extra time and do take you to learn these different skills, that is when you can really set yourself apart and go from being an okay or a good Webflow developer to being a great Webflow developer. Now, the final thing I want to touch on is, should you go for the route of being a freelancer or having a job as a Webflow developer? Now, I don't recommend the way that I did it to almost anyone, and there's a couple reasons for this. When I started out in this whole ecosystem, I was only 18, so I had the privilege of being able to live at home while I was building the business, which meant that I didn't need to earn a lot of money in the short term. I could figure it out over the course of a year or two, then I was able to move out and do all the other stuff, but it took me some real time before I was able to actually kind of create a sustainable living from being a freelancer. And the other reason I don't recommend the path that I took, where it was kind of go all in on just learning everything and doing everything at once, is because I realized over the last kind of year or so that my superpower is just being incredibly determined and gritty and figuring out how I'm going to do something kind of to my own detriment in a lot of times, and I'll like smack my head against the wall over and over again until I eventually figure it out, which does slow you down, but ultimately is the reason why this worked for me, and I don't think it would work for a lot of people. Instead, I think there's a couple other ways that other people can do this, and I think these would work best for most people. Now, the first way to do it is to have a normal job, so something probably not related to design and development at all, the kind of job that doesn't really follow you home once you get home from work. You don't have to kind of think about it, you don't have to be doing a little bit of work at home, and then build a freelance business on the side. Now, this for most businesses is actually probably the best way to get into building a business. A lot of people think that one day they'll quit their job, they'll have absolutely nothing on the side, and then they'll be able to focus on that thing. They'll be able to focus on building that business. But the problem with this is when you quit, you have nothing. Like, you have to then figure out what are all these different things, and then you have the pressure of having to try figure it out all at once, which again is kind of like the system that I had in the beginning. Instead, for most people, what would actually work really well is to have a job that has nothing to do with this and just kind of gets you through. It kind of pays the bills but doesn't follow you home, and then build the freelance business on the side. So in the mornings, on the evenings, and then on the weekends, you're focused solely on building that freelance business, and that is the outward persona. That is the outward kind of thing that you're marketing, the thing that you're pushing, the lessons you're learning are all kind of at the expense of this other person paying you, in a sense, even though it's not actually kind of learning from that other job. You have it to kind of see you through and keep you going while you're learning all these lessons until you can eventually replace it with that freelance work. Now, that is the first option, but it's probably not the option I would have chose if I was 18 and I was starting out from the beginning. Instead, what I would have done is I would have learned the fundamentals. So at this point, we need to be kind of good enough to be able to build websites, in the sense that you can kind of build a website, add value, but you don't necessarily have to be an expert at this kind of thing. And then I would focus all my attention on getting a job at an agency. Now, if it could be an in-person agency, it could be a remote agency. I guess it kind of works with your location. So, you know, is there any agencies close to you? Like, or would you rather work online? Would you rather work remotely? So figuring that out is kind of a personal piece of this. But then when you actually work at an agency, the benefit of this is you figure out how agencies and freelancing and how all this stuff works, because there are so many pieces involved with being a freelancer. a lot of people probably don't want to be a freelancer when they figure out the fact that you have to do all the sales and the negotiation side of things. You have to invoice people, you have to do kind of all the operations and stuff, and then you have to go do the work. So the best part about getting a job at an agency in the beginning is that you can learn from people who are much further along than you, so you'll be able to learn much quicker, and you'll be able to learn these lessons that are not things that someone can teach you in a course or a YouTube video. You'll be able to understand how the overall ecosystem of doing service work works, because at least for me, it took me so long to figure out how to communicate with clients properly, how the whole process of kind of doing business and sales development works, and then marketing yourself, and then communicating with clients on the back end, and then delivering work to the clients. All of these are things you have to figure out alongside actually being good at what you do. And at this point, when you're in an agency, you may realize that you do actually just want a job. You do actually just want to be a really great Webflow developer. And this will save you a lot of time, because you'll be earning money, you'll build skills, and then you can make a decision. Do I want to start the freelance thing on the side? Do I want to start to kind of venture out as a freelancer? Do I want to stay at this agency and kind of rise up the ranks? Do I want to find a company who's looking for a Webflow developer, maybe a startup or something like that, and then work at that company? There's so many pieces involved here, and every situation is going to be different. Some people are much better working remotely. Some people like to work in person. Some people are cut out for the whole freelance thing. Some people are cut out for building a studio or an agency. And some people are much better as part of a team, because they can be exposed to things they wouldn't be able to be exposed to as a freelancer or an agency. They can learn quicker, and they have the security of actually having a job. I personally like running a business, but at the same time, that business stresses me out a bunch. And if I'm talking purely in terms of being the best possible Webflow developer out there, I would be a much better Webflow developer if I didn't decide to be a freelancer, if I didn't decide to also do design, if I didn't decide to then build an agency. If I was focusing solely on dedicating myself to being a Webflow developer, then I would be a much better Webflow developer as an individual. In my situation, it's nice because we have great Webflow developers on the team, and we can kind of enable each other with these different pieces. But ultimately, what we try to do anyway is figure out how can someone be really, really good at one of these things and grow in that skill set, because at the end of the day, you could be kind of top 1% or top 0.1% of a Webflow developer by committing all your time to doing that specific thing. So ultimately, I think that being a Webflow developer is a great idea in 2024, because overall this industry is growing so much, and there is a need for people who have real quality, people who are focused on being the best at what they do. Whether you decide to be a freelancer, to build an agency, or to be an individual who's working at a company doesn't really matter. It's all about how you work best and how you can expose yourself to different situations. It's also about the risks that you can bear, because if you need a job, then get a job. It doesn't matter what path you take. Ultimately, you just need to become really good at one thing. And when you become good at that thing, you'll have a lot more options. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'll be making more videos like this. So if you have any ideas, then just drop them in the comments and I'll cover those topics.